What if the very first civilization on Earth, the one older than every empire, every religion, every myth, never truly disappeared? What if they left clues everywhere? On our mountains, beneath our oceans, hidden in symbols we've dismissed for centuries. And what if those clues are not just relics of the past, but messages meant for us, right now? Today, we're not here to fantasize. We're here to confront a possibility that many fear because it forces us to rethink everything we were taught to believe about human history. Across the world, humanity is surrounded by evidence that challenges everything we have been taught about our past, yet most people walk past these mysteries without a moment of pause. We scroll, we rush, we complain, but we rarely stop to question the world that existed before us. We treat history as though it is complete, sealed, perfectly understood. A neat little story written in textbooks. But what if it isn't? What if the story we've been handed is only the last chapter of a much older, far more astonishing tale? What if the evidence of that forgotten chapter is right in front of us, lying quietly in the open, waiting for someone brave enough to ask why it exists? Look at Göbekli Tepe. Imagine standing on that dusty hill in southeastern Turkey, wind brushing your face, and beneath your feet are pillars carved with animals, symbols, shapes that should not exist for another 6,000 years. According to traditional history, 11,000 years old. That number is so large it almost feels unreal. It predates writing, predates farming, it predates the wheel. It predates every civilization we ever thought was the first. And yet, somehow, people with primitive tools lifted stones weighing more than a bus and arranged them in intricate circles with the precision of architects. These weren't scattered rocks, they were aligned, decorated, and engineered with intention. This wasn't the work of hunters who spent their days chasing animals. This was a planned, coordinated project, one that required leadership, mathematics, astronomy, and a shared vision. Now think about that for a moment. Why would hunter-gatherers build something so complex? Who taught them how to shape stone that perfectly? Where did they learn geometry, construction, artistic symbolism? Archaeologists can explain how old the stones are. They can show carbon, dated samples of the surrounding soil. They can study the carvings until their eyes blur. But when asked why this site exists, or how it was built, or who the teachers were, they fall silent. This silence is not laziness, it is humility, because they know the truth. This monument raises more questions than answers. This site alone forces us to confront a possibility that there was a civilization before the civilizations we know, a civilization sophisticated enough to pass down knowledge, teach techniques, inspire design that would echo for thousands of years. It may sound bold, even controversial, to say such a thing, but is it more unbelievable than assuming people who had never farmed, never built cities, and never created complex tools decided to wake up one morning and build history's first temple as casually as someone building a backyard shed? Progress does not leap from simple to extraordinary overnight. Growth is gradual, skills are learned, knowledge is inherited. Göbekli Tepe is too advanced for its time. So either humans were far more advanced than we ever believed, or someone older, wiser, and more capable taught them. And that is just one site. Let's leave Turkey for a moment. Let's travel across oceans to the edge of Japan, where beneath dark, cold waters lies something even stranger, the underwater monument of Yonaguni. Its terraces, steps, vast flat platforms sit hundreds of feet below the surface. Some say it is natural, the result of erosion. But stand above it in your imagination, look down, and you see right angles, carved stairs, and stone blocks so deliberate they resemble parts of giant ziggurats. Nature does many magical things, but nature does not consistently produce symmetrical staircases that descend into the sea in perfect sequence. Now, ask yourself the obvious question: how did a structure like that end up underwater? Sea levels were far lower during the last ice age, which means that if Yonaguni was built by humans, it predates not just Egypt, just Mesopotamia, but almost every civilization humans have ever recorded. It suggests that builders existed long before we were told civilization began. Again, the same pattern emerges: structures too advanced, too intentional, belonging to a time supposedly too primitive. Why does this matter? Because when two anomalies exist, people call them coincidences. When dozens exist, puzzles. But when hundreds exist across continents, structures, artifacts, myths, and alignments, then it is no longer a puzzle. It is evidence. And evidence, whether we like it or not, demands an explanation. But here's the real question we should be asking ourselves: why don't we see it? Why do we look at these sites and shrug them off as mysteries rather than messages? Maybe it's because accepting the truth behind them requires us to undo centuries of comfortable storytelling, requires admitting that human history might not be linear. It may have gone forward, then backward, then forward again. It may have risen, then collapsed, leaving ruins behind, like scattered breadcrumbs waiting for us to follow. Think about how we live today. We create smartphones, satellites, skyscrapers, digital networks, nuclear power. Now, imagine if, suddenly, through some catastrophic global event, the kind history tells us has happened before, our entire civilization vanished, flooded, burned, buried under ice or ash. What would remain after 10,000 years? Not your phone, not your laptop, not your car, not the internet, not your city, not your skyscraper. Almost nothing except stone structures, stone monuments, stone carvings, stone alignments. Now imagine future generations, thousands of years later, trying to piece together who we were. They would find fragments of our achievements, clues without context, mysterious sites built by people not advanced enough to create them. They would argue endlessly about how we lived, how we built, what tools we had. Underestimate us, just as we underestimate the people of the deep past. This idea becomes even more compelling when you realize how little of Earth we have explored. Map the stars better than we map our own oceans. Over 70% of Earth's surface is ocean. Entire civilizations could have existed on coastlines that are now buried underwater from rising seas after the Ice Age. If we have only explored a fraction of the underworld beneath the Amazon, the Sahara, Antarctica, and deep mountain ranges, then how can we claim with certainty that we know our full past? And we shouldn't pretend that we do. The truth is simple. See, the first keynote forces us to confront the evidence we pretend not to see. This discomfort is necessary. Growth always begins with discomfort. Just like a child realizing for the first time that their parents don't know everything, humanity must accept that we don't know everything about our origin. And that is not frightening. It is empowering, because every unanswered question is an invitation. Every mystery is a door. Evidence from ancient sites doesn't close doors, it opens them. Another example lies in Peru, where walls of giant stone blocks fit together so perfectly that modern engineers shake their heads in disbelief. No mortar, no cement, just stones shaped so precisely that they lock together like puzzle pieces. Some blocks weigh 50 tons and were transported across mountains. We struggle today to move objects that heavy without industrial machines. Yet these ancient builders did it flawlessly. Where did this knowledge come from? Who taught them to work stone like that? It's not only the stones, it's the astronomy, it's the mathematics, it's the alignment with solstices and equinoxes. It's the same fingerprints appearing on sites separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, as if all these cultures inherited a similar blueprint from a shared source, a forgotten people who came long before them. Even the world's oldest maps, like the Piri Reis map, show accurate coastlines of Antarctica without ice, something impossible unless someone charted it thousands of years before the ice covered it. How? Who mapped territories that modern technology only rediscovered recently? Again, evidence whispers, even if we aren't ready to shout. Perhaps the most relatable part of all this is that every person, every single one of us, has experienced something similar in our own lives. Think about a moment when you discovered something that changed the story you believed. Maybe you found out your parents struggled more than you ever knew. Maybe you learned a truth about a friend or partner that shocked you. Maybe you realized one day that your career, your beliefs, your assumptions were built on incomplete information. Doesn't matter what the moment was, the impact is the same. You awaken, you expand, you re-evaluate everything. That same awakening is what humanity needs now. These ancient clues are not merely academic puzzles. They are reminders that knowledge can be lost, civilizations can fall, and truth can hide in plain sight for thousands of years. They remind us that human beings are far more resilient, more intelligent, more capable than the soft, modern version of ourselves we see today. Remind us that greatness once existed before and could exist again. And above all, remind us that dismissing evidence simply because it doesn't fit our expectations is the fastest way to stay blind. If our ancestors had done that, we would still believe the earth is flat. We would still think the sun revolves around us. We would still treat diseases with superstition instead of science. Humanity advances because someone somewhere refuses to ignore the evidence. Is why the first keynote matters, not because it answers every question, but because it gives us permission to ask them, because it encourages us to see, not just with our eyes, but with curiosity, with courage, with humility, and because it reminds us of something profound: the world is older, wiser, and far more mysterious than we imagine. And maybe, just maybe, clues we've ignored for so long were left for us intentionally, so that when we reached a moment of crisis or awakening, we would finally be ready to understand them. Every ancient culture that has ever carved a story into stone, painted symbols on temple walls, or passed their wisdom through the voices of elders carries a memory, an old, haunting, strangely familiar memory of a civilization that existed before all others. You find this memory in the deserts of Egypt, in the jungles of Central America, in the mountains of Peru, in the frozen lands of the Inuit, and even in remote island tribes who had no contact with the outside world. And what makes this so extraordinary is that these cultures, separated by oceans, languages, by belief systems, by time itself, they all tell the same story. Not a similar story, the same story. They speak of a great civilization or great teachers who came before them. They speak of people who possessed knowledge beyond their time, the knowledge of the stars, the seasons, architecture, the movement of the heavens. They speak of beings, sometimes human, sometimes godlike, who brought wisdom, technology, medicine, agriculture, mathematics, and laws long before those cultures were capable of creating such things on their own. And almost always, the stories end the same way, with catastrophe. A flood, a fire, a collapse, a night when the world shook or burned or drowned. Now, in the modern world, we hear the word myth, and we immediately think fiction. We assume ancient people lacked intelligence, that they created stories to explain things they didn't understand. If you've ever talked to a grandparent, if you've ever listened to the way elders pass down memories, you know something profound. Stories carry truth, just not always in the form we expect. And over generations, details get wrapped in symbolism, mixed with metaphor, reshaped with spiritual meaning. But the core truth remains. So the question is not whether the myths are real in every detail. The question is why cultures with absolutely no connection to one another, living in different hemispheres, came up with the same core memory. If one group spoke of a great flood, another of sky, beings descending with knowledge, another of a golden age that ended in disaster, you might call it coincidence. But when you find these themes in almost every ancient culture on Earth, from Siberia to South America, from Polynesia to Africa, it becomes clear humanity is remembering something it experienced. Let's begin with one of the most well-known examples, the Sumerians. Often credited with creating the first writing system, the first cities, the first laws. But in their own records, written in cuneiform on tablets that have survived thousands of years, they openly state that they did not invent their knowledge, said their wisdom came from earlier beings who lived before the Great Flood. They described kings who ruled for unbelievably long periods, then a catastrophe that wiped everything away. Only after the flood did their civilization restart. In other words, they were not the beginning, they were the continuation. Now, shift across the world to the Maya. Their stories tell of a previous age destroyed by water. They believed the gods, or ancestors, depending on the interpretation, attempted several creations before finally shaping human beings. Each version ended in disaster. Their famous calendar, often misunderstood in modern pop culture, wasn't predicting the end of the world. It was referencing the cycles of destruction and rebirth that their ancestors remembered. Again, creation, rise, knowledge, catastrophe, rebirth. Move now to ancient Egypt. Egyptians wrote about a period called Zeptipi, the first time, a golden era when the gods walked among humans and taught them everything: architecture, agriculture, medicine, astronomy. But the word gods is misleading. In ancient cultures, gods didn't always mean divine beings. It often meant ancient ancestors so advanced that their knowledge seemed supernatural. Just as today, if someone from the year 3025 traveled back to the Stone Age with a smartphone or a drone, people would call them a god. The Egyptians believed their civilization was a memory of something older, something greater that came before. And then you have the Greeks. They told of Atlantis, not as a fantasy, as a historical account given by Egyptian priests to Solon, who passed it down. Atlantis was described as a powerful civilization that fell in a single night due to cataclysmic natural forces. Whether Atlantis was literal or symbolic, the idea is consistent with global myths: an advanced people destroyed suddenly. Even the Australian Aboriginals, the oldest continuous culture on Earth, have Dreamtime stories speaking of sky heroes and ancestral beings who came long before humans, shaped the land, taught them survival, law, and harmony. These stories go back tens of thousands of years. They are not casual campfire tales. They are sacred memories preserved through millennia. So why does this matter? It matters because we often underestimate the accuracy of oral traditions. But modern science has proven that oral stories can survive with stunning accuracy across thousands of years. For example, indigenous tribes in the Pacific passed down stories of islands sinking beneath the water. For centuries, people dismissed them as legend, but modern geological studies revealed those islands did sink after volcanic collapses generations ago. Similarly, Native American flood stories match the timeline of ice dams breaking at the end of the Ice Age. Recent DNA and migration evidence confirms patterns described in ancient myths that scientists once thought were imagination. What does this mean? It means that ancient stories deserve more respect than they receive. They are not childish fantasies. They are human memory, wrapped in poetry, preserved in metaphor, carried forward through generations who refuse to let the past die. But perhaps the most emotionally powerful part of this topic is this: myths are a form of inheritance. Just like families pass down stories of where they came from, the hardships they endured, the triumphs they achieved, ancient cultures pass down memories of their origins. Just like a family may exaggerate or soften details, over time, the heart of the story remains. If your grandmother tells you about fleeing war or enduring famine, the emotional truth is real even if the small details shift with time. The same applies to humanity's ancient myths. Imagine standing around a fire thousands of years ago. Ancestors had no books, no libraries, no digital backups. They had one tool to preserve their history: storytelling. So they made their stories powerful, memorable, woven with emotion so strong that people would pass them down faithfully. They told of the great civilization that fell. They told of the teachers who helped rebuild humanity. They told of the catastrophe that changed everything. And they repeated these stories not for entertainment, but because they believed the future needed to remember. Imagine how heartbreaking it would be for them to see that thousands of years later we dismiss their memories as fantasy. We treat their warnings as fairy tales. We walk through their ruins taking selfies instead of listening to what the stones are trying to tell us. That is why this keynote matters. Because it reminds us that the past wasn't silent loudly. It left stories, clues, memories, symbols. It tried to share its wisdom. And if cultures separated by oceans all describe the same events, then we must ask, how could that be possible? Unless they were remembering something real. To understand the emotional depth of this, imagine survivors of a global catastrophe scattered across continents. They lose their cities, their technology, their records, their entire way of life. All they have left is memory. Scattered groups rebuild slowly, passing down the stories of what came before. Over time, their languages evolve, their symbols change, their environments shape the details of their myths, but the core message of a time before the catastrophe survives. That message becomes the foundation of their culture. This is why Egyptians, Maya, Sumerians, Greeks, Chinese, Hindus, Polynesians, Aboriginals, countless tribes all remember a first civilization that came before them. Not because they copied each other, not because they traded ideas across oceans they didn't know existed, but because they inherited fragments of the same ancient memory. The stories are not identical, because memories aren't identical, but the patterns match. The themes match. The sequence is astonishingly consistent: creation, rise, knowledge, catastrophe, fall, rebirth. Even modern psychology supports this idea. Humans remember emotional events far more strongly than ordinary ones. If a cataclysm destroyed the world, if entire landscapes were swallowed by water or fire, if survivors clung to life in the ruins of their former greatness, that trauma would echo for generations. It would become myth, legend, and sacred teaching. It would become the foundation of every culture that rose afterward. And this is what makes the ancient stories too real to ignore. Because if these myths were random, they would vary wildly. They don't. Instead, they match again and again like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. And once you start connecting the pieces, you feel something shift inside you. begin to understand that humanity's past is much deeper, much older, and much more shared than we ever imagined. Here is the part that resonates deeply with anyone who has ever experienced loss. These stories feel like grief. They feel like remembrance. They feel like longing for something that was lost but not forgotten. They carry the emotional weight of a family mourning its ancestors, trying desperately to preserve the memory of who they once were. This is why the myths matter. Not because they are perfect historical records, because they speak with the voice of ancient humanity reaching out across time. They are the echoes of ancestors saying, "We lived, we learned, we loved, we fell. Do not forget us." And when every culture on Earth carries that same echo, we owe it to them, and to ourselves, to listen. When you look at the great monuments of the ancient world, the pyramids of Egypt, the megaliths of Peru, the precision-cut stones of Bolivia, astronomical alignments in Cambodia, you can't help but feel that something doesn't add up. We have been taught to see these marvels as isolated achievements, built independently by cultures with no shared connection, no shared communication, and no shared knowledge. Yet the deeper we look, the more impossible that explanation becomes. It's like looking at fingerprints left on different objects in different continents across different eras, yet all belonging to the same hand. Similar patterns, similar alignments, similar construction methods, similar mythological themes, similar mathematical codes. These similarities are so vast and so specific that brushing them off as coincidence feels like ignoring an elephant standing in the middle of a silent room. Across the ancient world, structures built thousands of miles apart mysteriously follow the same architectural intelligence. Take the concept of aligning monuments with celestial bodies. Why did civilizations in Egypt, Central America, and Britain, all with no known contact with one another, build their temples in alignment with solstices, equinoxes, and constellations like Orion? Why did they measure time using nearly identical methods? Why did they divide the sky the same way? Why did they use the same sacred numbers such as 72, 108, 360, 432, 2160? All numbers related to the precession of Earth, a cycle that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete, something impossible to calculate without long-term astronomical observation. These parallels aren't small or superficial. They're profound, deliberate, and technically demanding. If you walked into a city today and saw identical architectural blueprints in buildings across different neighborhoods, you wouldn't assume it happened randomly. Assume a shared architect, a shared school, a shared source of knowledge. Yet when we see this across ancient civilizations separated by oceans, mountains, and thousands of years, we refuse to make the same logical assumption. We call it coincidence. Coincidence cannot explain why stones weighing 50 tons were carved and moved in similar ways in both Peru and Egypt. Coincidence cannot explain why pyramids appear in nearly every corner of the ancient world. Take the pyramids. We are told each culture invented the pyramid shape independently. Really the simplest explanation. Why pyramids and not domes? Why not towers? Why the same sloping sides? Why the same astronomical alignment? Why the same focus on cardinal directions? Why the same sacred geometry? The odds of hundreds of cultures generating the same architectural design for the same symbolic reasons, aligned with the same stars, are so small they border on impossible. And even if we believed they somehow invented it independently, that still doesn't explain the scale and precision of the construction. Think of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its alignment to true north is so precise that we cannot replicate it today with the same accuracy without advanced equipment. Its dimensions encode the circumference of the Earth. Its proportions reflect pi, the golden ratio, and the speed of light when converted through specific units used in ancient measurements. Go to the Sun Pyramid in Teotihuacan, Mexico, and you find the same mathematical signatures. Travel to Cambodia's Angkor Wat, and you see the temple layout mirroring the constellations. Visit Stonehenge, and you find a celestial clock. Even Easter Island's moai follow astronomical principles. It's as if someone handed ancient civilizations a blueprint, a universal template for how to build in harmony with the earth and sky. But who and how? This question becomes even more compelling when you consider another striking similarity, the way ancient cultures described their knowledge. They didn't claim to have invented these techniques. They said the knowledge was given to them, taught, inherited, passed down. The Egyptians said their wisdom came from the first time, a forgotten age. The Maya said their calendar was inherited from earlier beings. The Sumerians claimed their kingship was handed down from heaven before the flood. Inca said their stonework came from a race of earlier giants or master builders. Different words, different styles, different symbols, yet the same core message. They were remembering something, not inventing it, and this is where the emotional truth begins to rise. Because we all understand what it means to inherit something without fully understanding its origin. We inherit family traditions without knowing where they came from. We inherit habits, beliefs, fears passed down from generations who lived through things we never saw. A grandmother hands down a recipe, but part of the recipe came from her grandmother, part of that from someone even earlier. The details get blurry, but the tradition survives. Humanity functions the same way. Knowledge can be passed down long after the context is forgotten. Techniques can survive even when the story of who created them disappears. Now imagine a civilization thousands of years before the ones we recognize, one that achieved an extraordinary understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Imagine this civilization enduring a catastrophic event: floods, volcanic eruptions, comet impacts, climate shifts. Imagine survivors scattered across continents, carrying fragments of their knowledge, teaching early humans what they remembered in ways those humans could understand. Over generations, the scientific explanations become myths. The teachers become gods. The cataclysm becomes a punishment from the heavens. But the knowledge, the actual techniques, survive through architecture, star mapping, geometry, and sacred numbers. This scenario doesn't require fantasy. It requires only a basic understanding of how knowledge echoes through time. The emotional impact of this is profound. It makes us rethink our place in history. It makes us realize that we are not the peak of human achievement. We are simply another chapter. That idea is humbling, but also empowering. It connects us to something greater than ourselves. Take a moment to imagine how easy it is to lose history. Modern world were to collapse today through a global disaster. What would survive in 10,000 years? Not your phone, not your skyscrapers, not your planes or computers. Metal rusts, plastics decay, concrete crumbles, digital data evaporates, even books turn to dust. The only things that would survive are stone structures and stories, just as they did from the ancient world. Future generations stumbled upon the ruins of New York or Dubai or Tokyo without context. They'd be just as confused as we are today when we look at the pyramids. They'd see monuments too advanced for the survivors they encounter. They'd assume those survivors built the ruins. But that assumption would be wrong, just as some of our assumptions about the ancient world may be. And that opens the door to another powerful question. What if the early civilizations we celebrate, Egypt, Sumer, Indus Valley, Maya, were not the beginning of human intelligence, but the rebirth of it? What if they were like children inheriting the library of their ancestors, using the books but not knowing who wrote them? This possibility becomes even more convincing when you examine the one thing ancient cultures prioritized above all else: the preservation of knowledge. They encoded wisdom in stone because stone survives. They carved astronomical cycles into temples. They hid mathematical constants in architecture. They aligned monuments with permanent celestial features so that even if language was forgotten, the meaning could one day be rediscovered. Treated knowledge like a treasure chest left behind for the future, locked with clues only curiosity could open. Even today, we see echoes of this. When humanity sent messages into space, like the Voyager Golden Record, we encoded our knowledge in symbols, diagrams, and mathematics because we believed those things would outlast language. The ancients were doing the same thing. They weren't just building temples. They were sending messages meant to survive catastrophes, invasions, migrations, and time. This realization changes the way you look at the world. Suddenly, the similarities in ancient structures aren't coincidences. They're signatures. They're evidence of a shared origin, a shared inheritance. And when cultures with no contact share the same architectural style, the same astronomical knowledge, the same symbolic mathematics, the same mythological themes, the same sense of a catastrophe that ended an earlier world, it becomes harder to dismiss the possibility of a common source. The emotional weight of this idea hits hardest when you imagine the people themselves, the ones who lived through the cataclysm. Imagine the fear in their eyes when their world collapsed. Imagine the loss, the grief, the desperation to save what mattered, to preserve knowledge for the children of the future. Imagine them carrying fragments of wisdom across oceans, across mountains, across deserts, hoping someone someday would understand. That level of emotional truth cannot be ignored. These weren't myths. They were memories. They were warnings. They were clues. Every monument, every alignment, every ancient similarity is one more reminder that humanity's story is bigger, older, and more connected than we ever imagined. The ancient world was not silent. It left its voice in stone, and stone, unlike flesh, does not forget. When we talk about ancient civilizations leaving behind clues, people often jump straight to the physical monuments, carvings, patterns in stone. But some of the most powerful hints pointing to a forgotten chapter of human history are not made of rock at all. They are embedded in the sky, written in the mathematics of stars, planets, cosmic cycles. And what makes this so extraordinary is that these clues appear consistently across cultures separated by oceans, millennia, and worldviews. They all share knowledge so sophisticated, so astronomically precise, that it raises a question too big to ignore. How did they know? Look at the night sky. Our ancestors saw not just stars, a map, a detailed, structured, carefully measured map. And the strange thing is that so many early civilizations seem to have understood it far more deeply than we can comfortably explain. Take precession, for example, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes roughly 2,520 years to complete one cycle. This is not basic stargazing. This is not noticing that a bright star appears in the same place each season. This is advanced astrophysics. It requires calculating minute changes in star positions over generations. Yet cultures around the world seem to track this long cycle long before telescopes existed. The ancient Egyptians encoded it through references to the Great Year. The Maya structured their long count calendar around similar cosmic cycles. The Hindus preserved it through the concept of the yugas, Three civilizations, thousands of miles apart, no contact, no shared language, but the same advanced astronomical number buried in their worldview. Of course, mainstream explanations argue that brilliant individuals in each culture simply observed the sky carefully over centuries, and perhaps that is partly true. But when you realize what precession demands, a precision of measurement so fine that it would be hard to achieve even today without instruments, the story becomes harder to accept at face value. It's not impossible, but it is deeply improbable. And improbability, stacked repeatedly across cultures, begins to look less like coincidence and more like inheritance. If they were remembering something rather than discovering it from scratch. And there's another strange thread woven through these ancient star teachings. Insist that the sky is not just a backdrop, it's a teacher, a calendar, a warning system, a clock of ages. Why would so many early societies put such overwhelming importance on the heavens unless they believed the sky held secrets essential for survival? And who taught them to think that way? When you look at the alignment of monuments like the Giza pyramids, which mirror the layout of the Orion belt as it appeared thousands of years before the pyramids were officially built, the mystery deepens. How could a civilization supposedly at the early stages of development align structures so perfectly with a star pattern that only matched the sky in 500 BCE? Why choose that date? Why reach back into deep time unless they were marking something significant? And the same phenomenon appears all over the world. The ancient Nabta Playa stone circle in the Sahara predates Stonehenge by thousands of years, yet it too is aligned with Orion. The pyramids of Teotihuacan in Mexico reflect the same constellation. Chinese astronomy mapped Orion as the seat of cosmic authority. Aboriginal Australians saw it as the home of ancestral beings. Different cultures, again and again, pointing to the same stars with an intensity that feels less like coincidence and more like shared memory. And let's not forget the Dogon tribe of Mali. Long before the West discovered the star Sirius B, a white dwarf completely invisible to the naked eye, the Dogon people already knew not only that it existed, but that it was extremely dense, extremely heavy, and orbited Sirius A every 50 years. These are facts that modern science only confirmed with advanced telescopes. Yet the Dogon possessed them centuries earlier. So where did they get that knowledge? They say it was taught to them by visitors who came from the star. Whether that's literal or metaphorical, astronomical knowledge remains undeniably real. And then there's the shockingly precise understanding of planetary cycles found in ancient calendars. The Mayan calendar, for instance, predicted eclipses with astonishing accuracy. The Saros cycle of 18 years that modern astronomy uses to forecast eclipses. The Maya understood it centuries before anyone in Europe did. The same civilization calculated the length of the solar year to an error margin of just 0.02. That level of accuracy is so tight, so refined, it surpasses the Gregorian calendar we use today. How did they do that without telescopes, without complex machinery, without satellites observing the sun's movement? Some people say it was luck, or trial and error, or religious obsession. But even obsession does not explain perfection. You do not stumble accidentally onto the most precise solar calendar ever created by simply carving symbols into stone and hoping for the best. That kind of precision demands inherited knowledge someone had already tested and already understood. The pattern becomes even more compelling when you consider how these ancient astronomical systems often align with larger mythological stories about cycles of destruction and renewal. Indians spoke of world ages that rise and fall, The Maya described worlds destroyed and reborn. The Greeks spoke of ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. These weren't just poetic metaphors, they were tied to long-term cosmic cycles, often reflecting the movement of Earth through the galaxy or changes in the tilt of our axis. So either these ancient societies all independently decided to tie moral or spiritual cycles to astronomical events, or they were remembering something, some catastrophic event in humanity's deep past that reshaped their understanding of the cosmos. And here's where the emotional part hits. Being part of a civilization that lived through something truly devastating, a comet, a supervolcanic eruption, a global flood triggered by melting ice sheets, something so enormous that it changed the face of the Earth and almost wiped humanity out. Wouldn't you want to warn the generations that come after you? Wouldn't you try to encode that warning in the only language that could survive time, stars, monuments, and stories? Think about Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a site that predates agriculture, cities, and writing. Yet it's filled with symbolic carvings that researchers believe represent constellations, possibly telling the story of a meteor storm around 900 BCE, the same period the Younger Dryas cooling began, a cataclysm that nearly extinguished early human populations. If that interpretation is correct, Göbekli Tepe isn't just a temple, it's a cosmic warning left by survivors of an earlier civilization trying to record what happened to them. They couldn't write books yet, but they could carve the sky into stone. The same is true for the Nazca lines in Peru. These enormous figures only make sense from the sky. Why would a culture without flight build things that can be best viewed from high above? And why do so many of these geoglyphs align with solstices, planetary paths, and stellar risings? Again, astronomy is the key. Again, the message seems to echo the sky matters. And if you take a moment to really reflect on this pattern, it begins to feel personal. What these ancient people were trying to communicate is not just that they understood the sky, but that the sky shaped who they were. They saw cycles in the heavens and cycles on earth. They connected them. Death and rebirth, destruction and renewal, ages of darkness followed by ages of flourishing. They saw their lives woven into something enormous, something cosmic. In that sense, they were more advanced than we are today, not technologically, but philosophically. They carried a sense of belonging in the universe that we, with all our technology, often lack. And there's a humility in that, a humility we desperately need now, because in our modern rush to prove we are the pinnacle of civilization, we overlook the possibility that we might be the fragment, not the beginning, not the culmination, but the remnant of something older and wiser. When you stand beneath a clear night sky and look up at the stars, you can feel it, that quiet, unsettling sense that maybe our ancestors were trying to tell us something. Maybe they understood that time is not linear, that civilizations rise and fall in rhythms far, far greater than a single lifetime. Maybe their stories, their alignments, their cosmic references were meant to remind us that we are part of something infinitely vast and endlessly repeating. And when you look at the consistency across ancient cultures, the same stars, the same cycles, the same cosmic messages, you cannot help but wonder whether they were all remembering the same teacher. Not a person, not a prophet, but a previous civilization, one that lived long before our recorded history, one that understood the sky not just as decoration, but as a blueprint, one that left behind clues scattered across continents, waiting for us to notice. If there is one truth that echoes through every ancient ruin, every forgotten carving, every strange alignment pointing toward the heavens, it is this: the people who came before us were trying to speak. They were trying to send a message forward in time, across millennia, across collapses and rebirths of civilizations, across the loss of language and memory. They carved it in stone because stone endures. They encoded it in myth because stories survive when empires fall. Buried it in mathematics because numbers remain the same whether spoken in Sumerian, Sanskrit, or English. And yet somehow we have convinced ourselves that they were unsophisticated, primitive, incapable of understanding the world with the depth we assume only modern science can provide. But what if that isn't true? What if the deepest message they were trying to pass on wasn't about planets or pyramids or even catastrophes, but about us, about who we are, what we are capable of, what we must remember if we want to survive? Because when you peel away the symbols and the stone, the myths and the measurements, what remains is a thread, a shared insistence that human beings carry extraordinary potential. Nearly every ancient culture speaks about a time when humanity lived in greater alignment with the world, when people held knowledge we no longer possess, when connection to nature, the cosmos, each other was stronger. These aren't just romantic stories from nostalgic elders. They are reminders, warnings, invitations. Take the ancient texts of India, for example. They speak of civilizations so advanced in thought and spiritual discipline that they could see knowledge without tools. They described states of awareness that sound suspiciously like what modern neuroscience is only now beginning to understand: how meditation strengthens the brain, intention alters behavior on a biological level, how emotion affects the body's chemistry. Thousands of years ago, they already understood that human consciousness is not a passive passenger, but an active force. They said the mind shapes experience, not the other way around. And today, experiments in psychology, quantum theory, and epigenetics suggest they may not have been exaggerating. Or consider the Greeks, who wrote of a forgotten age when humans lived with a clarity of perception that modern man would consider extraordinary. They believed we lost something internal, not external. They believed knowledge wasn't simply discovered but remembered. Socrates insisted that learning is merely recalling what the soul already knows. What kind of civilization creates philosophies like that unless they believe they'd once lived at a higher level, unless they'd seen evidence of it? Even the ancient Egyptians hinted at this when they described the followers of Horus, a group of semi-mythical elders said to have been keepers of wisdom before dynasties existed. Their texts speak not only of architectural mastery, but of moral and spiritual power, clarity, discipline, balance. They emphasize the idea that inner order creates outer order. When you look at their architecture, their geometry, their meticulous alignment with the cosmos, you see that belief carved in stone. And the more you explore, the clearer the theme becomes. Ancient cultures weren't trying to impress us with monuments. They were trying to teach us something about ourselves. Something we've forgotten. Something modern life has buried under noise and speed and ambition. They were trying to show us that human beings are not small, helpless, accidental creatures fumbling through life, capable of extraordinary thought, extraordinary connection, extraordinary resilience. They understood this because they lived it. And they knew something else, something far more urgent. When human beings forget who they are, civilizations collapse. Look around today and ask yourself, have we forgotten? Because for all our technological brilliance, for all our satellites, skyscrapers, algorithms, and machines, how many of us truly feel connected? How many of us feel grounded? How many of us feel clarity, purpose, inner strength? We have information, but little wisdom. We have communication, but shallow connection. We have convenience, but deep restlessness. And perhaps the loudest message left by the ancient world is this: advanced in technology is not the same as becoming advanced as a species. Think about the legends of Atlantis. Whether it existed physically or symbolically, every version of the story describes the same downfall: incredible capability mixed with a loss of humility, knowledge without balance, power without wisdom, a society that forgot the internal foundations that made it strong. And the moment it lost that inner equilibrium, the entire civilization collapsed. The message is clear enough that you don't need to believe Atlantis was real to understand it. A civilization that becomes arrogant, disconnected, or spiritually empty cannot sustain itself. Side crumbles when the inside is hollow. And when you compare that to our world today, the parallels are uncomfortable. We are more advanced than ever, yet more anxious than ever. Communicate instantly, yet we misunderstand each other constantly. We live longer, but our mental and emotional health is in crisis. We've built machines to explore the universe, but we barely explore our own inner lives. We've conquered distance, but lost depth. We've developed cures, but created diseases of loneliness, comparison, and identity. This is exactly what ancient cultures tried to warn about, that if humanity focuses only on the external, things, structures, technologies, we forget the internal qualities that make civilization thrive in the first place. And this is where their final clue becomes powerful. They left stories of cycles. Cycles of forgetting and remembering. Cycles of growth and collapse. Cycles where humanity rises, falls, and rises again. Not just because of natural disasters or wars, but because of who we become inside. The Hopi people speak of previous worlds destroyed because humans lost their spiritual balance. Maya described earlier ages where societies grew technologically advanced but morally weak. The Egyptians wrote of resets, periods when knowledge was lost because people no longer lived in alignment with it. They weren't saying this because they were pessimistic. They were saying it because they had lived through it. They knew what it meant to start again, to rebuild, to relearn. And they believed that every collapse carried a lesson. Forgetting who we are is the most dangerous disaster of all. The beauty of this message is that it isn't hopeless. It isn't a prophecy of doom. It's an invitation to awaken, a call to remember what humanity is capable of before we reach another turning point. When you study ancient ruins, you don't just see stones, you see resilience, you see endurance, you see people who lived through unimaginable challenges, ice ages, cataclysms, migrations, and still found ways to encode knowledge for the future. You see people who knew their world could end, but believed in the people who would come after them. They believed in us, and that belief matters. It means they saw humanity not as a single generation or a single era, but as a continuous story, a lineage, a long chain of survivors, learners, and dreamers. They trusted that even if their civilization fell, the next one could rise stronger. They trusted that knowledge could be lost, but rediscovered. That wisdom could be buried, but unearthed. That humanity has a way of rising again and again, no matter how many times the world resets. Maybe that is the greatest clue they left behind, that we are more powerful, more adaptable, and more extraordinary than we realize. That buried inside us is the same strength that survived the Ice Age, crossed oceans, built monuments aligned with the stars, mapped the heavens, carried knowledge through dark ages into rebirth. That we come from people who refuse to give up, who refuse to let their story die, who refuse to believe that collapse meant the end. If they believed so fiercely in the future, why shouldn't we? If they carved messages for us, maybe it's because they wanted us to remember the things that matter most: curiosity, courage, unity, reflection, balance, the ability to dream beyond our limitations and rise beyond our circumstances. They wanted us to see that civilization isn't measured by what we build, by who we become. And in a strange way, when you stand in front of an ancient monument, whether it's a pyramid, a stone circle, a desert carving, you can almost feel it whisper across time, that sense of someone saying, "We were here, we learned, we suffered, we rose, and you will too." It's not just a relic, it's a reminder, a mirror. A message saying that every generation faces a choice to repeat the mistakes of the past or to rise wiser because of them. That is the final clue. And it might be the most important one of all. The end, when we step back and look at all these clues. The monuments aligned with stars, the shared myths of forgotten ages, the mathematical brilliance carved into stone, the cosmic warnings encoded in calendars, the quiet insistence from every ancient culture that humanity has risen and fallen before. We begin to see a much bigger story than the one written in our textbooks. We see a story of resilience, of survival, of knowledge carried across ages by people who refuse to let their wisdom die with them. And more than anything, we see a story about us, who we are and who we could become. Because maybe the real gift left by the first civilization is not just their architecture or astronomy, but their faith in the future, belief that the next generation, the one thousands of years beyond their own, would be capable of understanding their messages, capable of learning, capable of rising higher than they did. Now, as we stand at a crossroads of our own, with more power and more uncertainty than ever before, it is our turn to decide what we will do with the clues they left. Will we ignore them, or will we rise to become the civilization they hoped we would be?